Not a question of the day on this Monday, actually just a request. I rarely do this. In fact, I've never done this in the almost 200 episodes of this podcast. My request is that if you watch this content and you listen to this monologue, that you take the effort to share it, because I think what we are about to cover is so important that every single person in the world, especially people that are raising children, need to see it. They need to understand this. And we are going to be discussing Dr. John Money, which is a name that I want every single person in the world to know. And if you've seen What is a Woman, you probably already know that name, but you are still going to shudder at details regarding who and what this man has contributed to society. Plus, later on in the show, we're here, we're queer, and we are coming for your children. That's not a quote from me. That is a quote that people were using as they marched in the streets to celebrate Pride. So let's talk about that. Let's lean into some of these Pride celebrations that are happening all around the country. All that and more today coming up on Candace Owens. It's a shame that Oprah is no longer on TV. She did cover a lot of heavy-hitting topics, namely this one going back to the year 2000, which was entitled, Why the Boy Who Was Raised as a Girl Forgave His Mother. Very interesting topic. Take a listen to that boy who was raised as a girl, forgiving his mother and speaking to Oprah about that experience of having been raised as a girl.
I never quite fit in. Well, the girls would do their things with their Barbies and things like that, and that wouldn't interest me. Mm-hmm. And things such as trucks and building forts and, getting into the odd fist fight and climbing trees, that's the kind of stuff that I like, but it was unacceptable, so I'd never...
As a girl?
As a girl, I had no place to fit in.
So that's David Reimer, and you should know that just 4 short years after that interview took place, David Reimer would be dead. Because on May 4th, 2004, he drove to a supermarket car park, and while he was sitting in his car, decided to pull out a shotgun and kill himself at the age of 38, because he had lived a life that was so full of pain and anguish. Now, I'm going to read you a ton of excerpts from this article that I had been seized by. I knew a lot of this information, not as far as the detail went. This article was written, by the way, by Tom Leonard for the Daily Mail, in which he explored that life of David Reimer because, well, David Reimer ended his life because he was experimented on by a man named Dr. John Money. And Dr. John Money is the spiritual father of the trans movement. Now, let me just say right off of the bat, I don't care where your politics are. I don't care if you're left-leaning or right-leaning, if you accept that people can change their genders or you believe that that is not a plausibility. This is just a historical document. We are talking about what actually happened. And it's important for you to know that so that you can be a better informed person dealing with a lot of these political subjects that we are submersed in today. So the story of David Reimer actually begins in 1965 when he was born as an identical twin. Then his name was Bruce, by the way. Brian and Bruce were born to a working class Canadian couple. He was a twin, born to Janet and Ron Reimer in Winnipeg, Canada. The boys were perfectly healthy, but after 7 months, they were having trouble urinating. On medical advice, their parents took them to the hospital to be circumcised. The following morning, the doctors rang with horrifying news. Instead of using a scalpel, an electric cauterizing pen had been used for the procedure, and in Bruce's case, the equipment had drastically malfunctioned. A surge in the current had entirely burnt off his penis, and surgeons would not be able to reconstruct it. This is just a horrible situation of a child being mutilated because his parents took him in for a circumcision. Mr. and Mrs. Reimer were young parents from a religious background, and they were bluntly informed by a psychiatrist that their son would be unable to consummate marriage or have normal heterosexual relations, and that they would have to recognize that he would be essentially physically defective. Naturally, they were distraught, but then a year later, in the spring of 1967, they saw a man named John Money, Dr. John Money, being interviewed on television. Enter this native New Zealander doctor who was trailblazing at the time, working at Baltimore's Johns Hopkins University, one of America's obviously most celebrated medical schools, where he had established the first United States clinic that performed sex reassignment surgeries, the first United States clinic. Janet and Ron watched him in fascination. He was charismatic, he was acclaimed, he was a researcher, and he described his theory that based on his work with intersex hermaphrodite patients who have been born with both male and female sex characteristics, he had decided that all babies were in fact gender neutral. This is where we're hearing this term. He decided that no matter their genitalia, any baby could be streamed in one direction or the other, thanks to hormone injections and surgery into a gender that was chosen by others. Now, the Reimers, of course, were desperate at this time. They wanted to ensure that their mutilated son would have some chance at a normal life, and they saw this as a possible solution. Okay, so we can just maybe say he's not even our son. We can streamline him into the other direction. And they also provided for Dr. John Money a solution to his problem because, you see, up until that point, he hadn't been able to conduct his experiments on children of just one sex. Of course, the children that he was seeing were intersex children. So where was he going to find a test case baby who could demonstrate that his radical theory actually applied to all children that were not intersex? No parent, of course, would have voluntarily submitted their children to be raised as the opposite sex just to prove his point. But in the Reimers, he found a couple that was willing. They were attracted to the psychologist because Bruce's identical twin brother, Brian, represented what researchers would call a perfect control group. Obviously, they're twins against whom Dr. John Money could compare Bruce's progress as a female. So they picked one twin and decided, okay, this is going to be your life. Now, at that time, it was much easier to surgically construct a vagina than a penis, and Dr. Money was able to persuade the Reimers that Bruce should be raised as a female. But for the experiment to work, he said, neither of the twins must ever be told the truth. Now, could you imagine that? You, as your parents, you know that you have given birth to two males, but you decide, since you've accidentally mutilated one of them, that one of them is just going to be raised as a female, and you're just not going to tell anybody. Least of all, you are not going to tell them. So although they were initially reluctant to do this, Janet and Ron were so impressed by his intelligence and his persuasive powers that eventually they simply agreed. Bruce now became Brenda. They renamed him. And he was then castrated when she was 22 months old. A rudimentary vulva was fashioned for her by doctors at Dr. John Money's hospital. The sexologist prescribed that Brenda should start taking female hormones when she was 12. Now, the Reimers did not appreciate until later that the course that Dr. Money had so confidently outlined for Brenda was actually experimental, had never been attempted on a developmentally normal, that is, non-intersex child before. So they were a bit unwitting, I guess is the best way to say it. Janet said, I looked up to him like a god. She was in her teens, by the way, when she gave birth, and she simply accepted whatever John Money said. She would regularly write to the sexologist about Brenda's progress, and every year, the twins would visit him, Dr. John Money, and he would interrogate them at length. In 1972, when the children were 7, Dr. John Money published a book called Man and Woman, Boy and Girl, and it was about that particular case, although he gave the family pseudonyms. The experiment, he announced, had been a total success. The girl happily wore dresses and played with dolls, while her brother loved cars, soldiers, and climbing trees. So would you imagine that? So you have someone who's a renowned doctor, he's doing something as an experiment, and now he's publishing works and saying, this is a success. And now you have other people that are coming up in medical school. They're consuming this knowledge and they're going, okay, amazing. We never even considered this, that you could just set somebody on a course in a different direction despite the biological assignment that they were given at birth. But they were born as a male with male parts. Now Dr. John Money is disproving this theory. He had finally won international acclaim, which he had so long craved. Around the world, the idea of sex reassignment surgery for children suddenly became more acceptable. But Money always knew that the rosy picture that he had painted was far from accurate. As Brenda would later admit in interviews, both she and her brother knew early on that something was not right. Far from enjoying wearing them, Brenda tore off the lacy dresses that her mother made her wear and showed no interest in makeup. At age 4, Brenda said that she wanted to try out her father's razor. At age 6, Brenda announced that she wanted to be a refuse collector. Brenda hated playing with dolls and always chose her brother's toys instead. Her mother reassured her that she was just a tomboy. At school, Brenda never fit in. She was rejected by both the girls that she didn't want to play with and the boys that she desperately wanted to join. Brenda was bullied mercilessly, and even the teachers were uncomfortable around her. She was very rebellious. She was very masculine, and I could not persuade her to do anything feminine, said her mother, Janet, years later. Brenda had almost no friends growing up. Everybody ridiculed her, called her cave woman. She was a very lonely, lonely girl. What Brenda and her brother Brian particularly loathed were their annual trips to go see Dr. John Money for interviews that were conducted without the parents present. From the age of 6, the doctor would show them naked pictures of men and women, boys and girls, and of adults having sex. Screaming at them in fury until they obeyed, he would force them to strip off their own clothes and examine each other's genitals. These are twins, identical twins, and this is what Dr. John Money is making them do. Most twisted of all, he often asked them to play at thrusting movements and copulation, with the prepubescent siblings forced to pretend to have sex in various positions in front of Dr. John Money. These encounters would be photographed, and sometimes Dr. John Money would summon his academic colleagues to watch. Money was no impartial researcher. Having rebelled against his own repressive religious upbringing, he was a bisexual who championed nudity, open marriage, group sex, and hardcore pornography. He also had deeply unsettling views on children and sex. In 1980, he was accused of endorsing pedophilia and incest after he told Time magazine, quote, "A childhood sexual experience, such as being the partner of a relative or an older person, need not necessarily affect the child adversely." And yet this man was in Time magazine. He was allowed to work at Johns Hopkins University. He had these views of children, and now he is making 6-year-olds, one of which he has encouraged to change their private parts, copulate, and play at thrusting movements, pretending to have sex in various positions in front of him. These are historical facts. This is not being made up by me. It goes on to read that he reportedly told a Dutch academic journal that he did not see any problem with a sexual relationship between a boy aged 10 or 12 who's intensely attracted toward a man in his 20s or 30s. Brenda told the BBC in 2000, "I thought he was perverted. I thought he was a sick man." As Brenda grew older, she increasingly felt herself to be a male. She adamantly refused to have more extensive surgery to construct a new vagina, a procedure that Money regarded as essential to cementing his patient's psychological sex change. On the last occasion that Brenda was dragged to see Dr. John Money in her early teens, she ran to the roof of the building to get away from him. Although her parents and doctors had persuaded her to start taking the hormone estrogen when she was 12, leading her to develop breasts, and even as her voice became deeper, she threatened to commit suicide if they ever took her back to see Dr. John Money. By now, both girls and boys at school were refusing to let Brenda use their bathrooms, forcing her to relieve herself in a back alley. The Reimer family and other doctors who had supported Dr. Money's plan could see that Brenda's talk of suicide was serious, and so they backed off. In 1979, when Brenda was 14, she had made the decision to stop living as a girl. The following year, the twins' father took Brenda out for an ice cream and dropped the bombshell. Father told Brenda that she had actually been born a boy named Bruce, had suffered a botched circumcision, and had been raised as a girl on the advice of Dr. John Money. Brenda, he said, had always been a fiction. Within months, Brenda then changed his name to David, the David that we just showed you in that Oprah clip. He started taking male hormones and had his breasts surgically removed. He finally made a close friend, one of his brother's pals, Harold Normand. This week, Harold Normand told the Mail that he and David shared a passion for tinkering with cars. Mr. Normand also revealed that when asked, the Reimers would gloss over why Brenda had suddenly disappeared at age 14 and David had suddenly appeared in Brenda's place, unconvincingly claiming that Brenda had actually been a cousin who had died in a car accident while Dave was a long-lost brother. Yet while the teenage David was far happier as a male, Mr. Normand told the Mail that he soon had to confront the limitations of his situation. Although he underwent the painful surgery to create a penis, it was hardly a proper substitute. David tried to have girlfriends, said Mr. Normand, but it didn't work out. He told one of them that he had had an accident with his genitalia, and suddenly the whole school knew and was laughing at him. Days later, after he had overdosed on antidepressants, his parents momentarily wondered whether it might not be kinder to just let him die. As David grew older, he desperately wanted to have children, but having been castrated as an infant on Dr. John Money's advice, he was physically unable to. Then his brother's wife introduced him to a friend, Jane Fontaine, who already had 3 children but no partner. David and Jane hit it off immediately, and they married in 1990. I would have to say that he was a great father and, a wonderful husband, and he was very romantic, said Jane, who has since died. It took David years to discover all of the lies that Money had told the scientific world about him, falsely presenting him as a successful case when, in fact, his life had been ruined by the doctor. David said that he wanted to physically attack Money if they ever met. In 1997, to spare other children similar treatment, he and Brian revealed the truth about Money's reprehensible behavior to one of the doctor's bitter academic opponents, Milton Diamond, who had become suspicious about Money's account of success. As David headed into his 30s, a series of personal setbacks, including losing his job, being defrauded of his savings, and separating from his wife, plunged him into severe depression. His relationship with his brother had always been difficult, but deteriorated completely after they discovered that they were really brothers. Brian had also been deeply upset by the deception, and Brian himself died from a drug overdose in 2002. Mr. Norman told the Mail that David's parents, both of whom have also since died, held a small funeral and buried Brian in a secret place because they were worried about disruption from callous local people who had never understood David's appalling situation and thought that he was better off dead. 2 years later, David shot himself. His parents blamed Dr. Money for traumatizing their child and turning him suicidal. They were also guilt-ridden, and Mrs. Reimer herself attempted suicide while her husband became an alcoholic. David never blamed his parents, nor did he ever forgive the 2 experts who ruined his life, the doctor who originally botched the circumcision and Dr. John Money, who died in 2006. The scars that he had from those 2 mentally affected him, said Mr. Norman. He'd get depressed about it. In 2004, the BBC Horizon program called this case a cautionary tale about what can happen when science pursues a beautiful theory with scant regard for human costs. It's a conclusion that has even greater resonance today. Again, that is an article that was written by Dr. Tom Leonard, and it's mind-boggling to me. It's scary to read something like this because this is the man that is considered the spiritual father of the trans movement. All of the phrases that we hear today are because of his lasting influence on the movement. It was him who initially theorized that this could happen, that you could take a child and you could push them into a different direction. And it was him who falsely wrote that his experiment on one such child was successful. And the truth is that it wasn't. I think it is incredibly important that every single person in the world understands who Dr. John Money is, since this is now become a very severe cultural debate and one that we are all victims to if we are raising our children in society. I have young children. We know what is going on in the school systems, and we know what is taking place. And so it became so important for me to just read you that story. It's been covered in What is a Woman, but not every person in the world has seen What is a Woman. And I think it is incumbent upon all of us, whether you have a platform or not, if you have a phone, a smartphone, and you can share this, you should share it. People need to know this man, because it appears that those who purport to support the trans movement don't want to talk about him. He was, in fact, a pedophile. He was a person that at least supported pedophilia and watched 6-year-olds emulating sex in front of him. These, again, are the facts, and it would be very disturbing to me if YouTube had an issue with us diving into actual, real history. And that's all I'm going to say about that. So Pride celebrations took place all across the nation this past weekend. I'm sure you saw some of the clips, and I just want to reveal them to you because obviously YouTube put me in timeout for an entire week. They wanted me to reconsider my positions on Pride, and I really now just want to platform it and allow people to hear what the community is thinking and saying. So let's first take a look at what went on at the New York City Pride Parade. Take a listen. Okay, there we go. We have it. We are here, we are queer, and we are coming for your children. Now, if I had said that, I would have had my account hit with a strike. But I guess if they say it, it's freedom and it's pride and it's them expressing how they personally feel. So we will leave it at that, absent any commentary. Now, let's jump into what's going on in Seattle. I love Seattle. What are they doing at the Pride Parade? Let's take a look. Oh my God. No, these men are fully naked. No, they're fully naked. Fully naked on bicycles, waving, and there are children in the crowd. What is going on? They're fully naked. Is this allowed? Okay. All right. I guess it's about freedom and it's about love being love. And if you are in love, most people want to get completely ass naked on a bicycle and ride around in front of children and families. I actually wanted to examine what Washington law was on that, because that's definitely not legal everywhere. According to the Washington state legislator, indecent exposure, a person is guilty of indecent exposure if he or she intentionally makes any open and obscene exposure of his or her person or the person of another, knowing that such conduct is likely to cause reasonable affront or alarm. The act of breastfeeding or expressing milk is not indecent exposure. Okay, so would that count as indecent exposure? No. I'm going to guess in Seattle, that is considered perhaps decent exposure because it's about love. So if men get naked, I can't think of any reason that I would want to be naked on a bicycle, but I guess this falls under pride. Let's stick with Seattle, though. Let's see what else they're doing. Take a look. And there's a man praying. He's a preacher. And they're just dancing in front of him and waving their trans flag and pride flags in front of him as he prays. Okay, I wonder why they are surrounding him. And that's not considered harassment, by the way. The person that is harassing is obviously him because he seems to be in prayer. And so it's necessary to surround that and make sure it doesn't happen when you're half naked at a pride parade. Let's stick with Seattle. This is a lot going on. What else is going on in Seattle? Oh, it's a fountain. And, oh, I'm sorry, we have a black bar in there because they're naked again. Well, there's a little kid running, and the mom seems okay with that. You can see the mother there. Apparently, I'm assuming it's the mother. She's got green hair. Kid just ran by. They're definitely in public, and there are definitely small children around at this fountain, completely naked again. Just trying to understand what is the carve out in the piece of legislation that allows for grown men to get naked in front of children if it's the month of June. Is there a carve out here? Is this about freedom? Is this about loving your partner and your spouse? I don't know. Anyways, as I said, not exactly allowed to say much more, but I think we're getting to a state where I'm okay with that. I think just shining a light and allowing people to tell you who they are is enough. You don't even need to add commentary on some of these situations.
After David died, there was an outcry. Dr. Money did not cause David's death, but his family felt that he was partly responsible. Because Dr. Money had pursued his theory in the face of convincing evidence that the gender assignment had not worked, they felt that he had traumatized their son in childhood to the extent that he became suicidal as an adult.
I would like to say to Dr. Money, I would like to ask him if he could be man enough to admit to the public and to even to himself that he made a mistake. He was trying to make history and it wasn't working.
As it became clear that it wasn't working, he could not let go of the case. It was too beautiful for him to let go of it, and I think that was unethical behavior on his part.
Horizon asked Dr. Money to participate in this documentary, but he declined. His former student, Richard Green, argues that Dr. Money did the best he could in an era when we knew less.
With the benefit of hindsight, based on what we knew at the time about how you become male or female or boy or a girl, with the advantage of hindsight, knowing the difficulties, to say the least, of creating a penis surgically, the decision that John Money made at the time was the correct one, and I would have made the same one at that time.
What we do know is that Dr. Money's theory that it is possible to raise a boy as a girl does not seem to hold true for most children. Nature, as far as gender identity is concerned, cannot be overridden by nurture. Above all, this is a cautionary tale. This is what can happen when science pursues a beautiful theory with scant regard for the human cost.
You're always going to see people that are going to say, well, the David Reimer case could have been successful. I'm living proof. And if you're not going to take my word as gospel, because I have lived through it, who else are you going to listen to? Who else is there? I've lived through it. Is it going to take somebody to wind up killing themselves, shooting themselves in the head for people to listen?